into and what they're investing in within the gaming space, I would highly recommend going and checking out Richard Lewis's channel, the Esports Journalist of the Year, as well.
Oh my fucking god. So that doc sent me to this video, and this video is sending me to another video?
Or, you know, as awarded by the Esports Awards again. I think that's 3 times that he's won that. For his many videos about Saudi Arabia investing into esports and gaming. I'm not going to go through every piece of that. I feel like Richard's done a fantastic angle there. But one of the things that I feel like people, when I've talked about this on my stream, that people aren't aware of is, why is this even a problem? After all, the ruler of Saudi Arabia is an avid gamer. That's what he says. I mean, shouldn't we love people that are avid gamers? And Hex from Optic has said that he has a kind face. Take a look at this clip. Now, if you're not aware of...
I love when they play clips I can fucking hear!
Who this is MBS, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. So we'll have a look. I mean, what has Hex got to say about this? Probably very hard-hitting analysis. He's got a kind face, a willing-to-help face. You'd get thrown out of a comic writer's room for writing a line like that because people wouldn't think it was believable for somebody to say something like that. It's absolutely monstrous. Now, I'm sure you've heard other people intent on taking some of Saudi Arabia's money talk about the fact that the country's making a lot of progressive moves, you know, moves in the right direction. And I'm going to talk about some of that during my video later on as well. And I'm sure you've heard some other people saying, well, you know, what about the USA? There's plenty of bad things that the United States does. And yeah, I do have some serious problems with how the US operates in many different things, especially going back further in history. And also right now in terms of how they're being so involved with Israel and what they're up to currently with the war happening. But I will address in this video some of the glaring differences that make this situation with Saudi Arabia a lot worse from a bunch of different avenues, actually, not just a moral avenue too. But let's kind of start from here. What is the problem with people from a certain country investing in things that we enjoy? I mean, just because they're from somewhere and that is like, you know, a place where bad things happen, doesn't mean that that's a bad thing for us, right? It's not like the people who are literally giving the money are actually the same people ordering immigrants being slaughtered at the border or something crazy like that, right? Right? Except that's exactly what's happening. When we say that Saudi owns something or Saudi bought something or Saudi's investing into something, the reason that people tend to say Saudi rather than, you know, X company from Saudi Arabia, it's not because they're ignorant of what's happening in the Middle East. It's because they're usually referring to the Public Investment Fund, which is literally money from the governing royal family that's being, you know, taken out of the ground with oil and, you know, the other small things that they that their GDP creates, and they're spending it directly on other investments. Now, sometimes it refers to their subsidiary, especially within our world, of the Savvy Gaming Group too. That's a subsidiary of the Public Investment Fund that's kind of their arm for investing in the video game industry. So it's coming, this money, from the state directly, from MBS directly, not from disinterested corporate parties who just happen to be living in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And to talk about a little bit about how Saudi works, it is an interlinked web of politicians, the royal family, who are frequently the same people, and people leading the sports investments, all three of which are just a tangled web, because all three of them can be the same people. You have the royal family, who run the entire show, are the politicians, who also are the heads of the sports bodies. So it's not like in most countries that you'll be familiar with, where the head of the sports body is somebody that gets appointed to that job, and then there are politicians, and then there might even be a monarch or another head of government that isn't exactly the same as the politician. But in Saudi Arabia, they're all intertwined, and if not the same people, working for the same interests.
I'm gonna be honest, still kind of confused with what this has to do with how it's bad.
They're heavily involved in every aspect of it, and they cannot ever be expected to act in the best interests of certainly the sports world, the esports world, the gaming, whatever their investment is. They can't be expected to act in the best interests of that if it ever conflicts with the interests of Saudi Arabia, because that's where they come from originally in terms of they are part of the state machine. It's not just that they have some kind of tied to their home country. It's not some kind of nationalism or patriotic feeling that would make them act that way. They are part of the state machine. They are the leaders of the state that are being involved in sports to a very strict degree in all of these investments. They've also set up a range of conflict of interests, and international sports organizations are frankly rife with corruption and not really set up to distangle those conflicts of interests. And so competitive integrity is going to be a large thing moving forwards, but that's not even really what we're going to touch on at all, because there's so many bigger ethical problems. For ethical reasons, though, the reason why I'm making such a big deal about the fact that it is the monarchy directly involved with the investment, that is so crucial. There are no checks and balances to this power at all. The people investing and the people wanting these events to occur are exactly the same people ordering the human rights abuses happening in Saudi Arabia. And the reason that they do so is for the same reasons too. They're investing in the sports for the same reason that they're clamping down extremely hard on their people too. It's all in order to control. It's bread and circuses, and a lot of circuses. So this is much more extreme than running events in other countries, and it's much more involved in their propaganda kind of arm as well than other countries would be too. Every event that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is kind of funding is tied into the sports washing idea, and every event promotes this country, which is currently committing some of the worst human rights abuses in the world. And I'm not saying that to be exaggerating or just because it happens to interflict with our, sphere of gaming and esports. That's just as much of a fact as you can get facts on this kind of thing. The bodies which watch out for human rights abuses around the world frequently have Saudi Arabia right up towards the tippity top. And there is a ton of whataboutism that ends up happening every time somebody brings this up. So I want to address the main one, which when I started talking about this on stream, the biggest one was not, other countries which are normally up at the top of that list as well. The biggest country that got brought up was, well, you used to live in, speaking to me, Sideshow, you used to live in the USA. You have attended events in USA and you don't seem to have any problems with that. So what about that? Isn't that just exactly the same as Saudi? And so I want to take some time just to preempt this counter, which I'm sure is going to be flooded in the comments anyway, despite me saying this. But let's go through it. First of all, the USA does not have some kind of monopoly on oppression. I feel like there is a sentiment with quite a number of people on the left who kind of think, in some bizarre reflection of US exceptionalism, that the US must be doing the bad things the worst in the world. I don't know exactly why people seem to think that, but unlike what a lot of people think, you can weigh moral crimes against each other to some degree and find other countries to be worse than the one where you live. You can still say, where I live, there are heinous things happening right now, but it's not quite as bad as it is over there. It's not quite as bad as what this country's doing. Or, on the other hand, we are doing things worse than this country, for example. Not everything is just, if it's bad, and we should give up. That is such a cowardly moral stance to hold, in my opinion. So, even if you refuse to compare the morality side of it as well, even if you said that the human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia, which I'm going to go through some of, are pretty similar to what's going on in the US. You, from an ethical point of view, don't see any difference between the two. Here's another massive difference. The US government is not running Champions LA directly to try and repair its reputation with the youth. It just isn't. Joe Biden does not know that Champions LA happened. I'm fairly sure. For the US fans who refuse to engage with this issue due to what they perceive as hypocrisy,
that makes sense.
If Joe Biden ordered hundreds of unarmed Mexican migrants to be gunned down at the border and then turned around and funded, promoted, and ran Champions LA to promote their progressive values as a country, all while paying people like Boaster not to say anything about it, and then trying to buy up the entire esports scene as well, that's the level that we're talking about right now. Can you imagine a situation in which that's happening? Of course we would be talking about it as well. Yeah, the idea that this is hypocritical, that we wouldn't say anything if it was a different country doing it, of course we would. We absolutely would. And in fact, we must. One of the things that this money is designed to do when we talk about sports washing is that it's designed to buy some kind of complicity and silence. If you watch our stuff, you can't shit talk us because you're part of it, because we're paying for the thing that you like. Fuck that. I mean, we've got to talk about it. We've got to make sure that we're not buying into and making the sports washing work. At the very least, if they're going to be throwing the money around, let's make it splash back in their faces a tiny amount, right? As much as we can do. So let's try and talk about a little bit. Let's pull back and talk about a bit of why Saudi is even investing heavily like this. So one of the things, right, when I was talking about the Public Investment Fund, they've even got a bloody 10% stake in Heathrow Airport. So when I said earlier that they're trying to get their fingers in as many pies as possible, yeah, they're all over the place. It's not just games and esports. We're not special for some reason. It's just that you might be hearing a lot about it because you're not really as interested in some other areas where Saudi is investing really heavily, but you are interested in gaming. So this is from the Vision 2030 website. So when the current leader of Saudi Arabia, MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, took over in what was essentially like a restructuring of the royal family, i.e. put a lot of people in, detained a lot of people and made sure that they were buying into his way of doing things, reorganized the entire structure, got rid of the religious police and just made them kind of work for him. So everything is just a top-down hierarchy right now. There aren't any conflicting powers. It's all centralized within the royal family. Anyway, when that happened, he also launched this ambitious project, Vision 2030. 2030 meaning when it's supposed to happen, I think. And the pillars here on the website seem very noble: a vibrant society, a thriving economy, an ambitious nation. Now, the idea of it is that Vision 2030 is a series of plans for what to do, mostly with the money, but some other things as well. But I'm going to focus on the economy side of things, where they're aiming to move the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's dependence away from oil. Countries that are based on getting their resources from the ground, from the land that you're on, generally not that great if the stuff that you're selling starts to go out of fashion, if people start moving away from having such an oil dependency, which is inevitable at some point in the future, and maybe that's not relevant for us to think about, but that is relevant for governing bodies to think about as well. So they're trying to move away from oil. And generally this is actually a good thing for states to do, right? The more that you diversify your streams of GDP, the ways in which your country makes revenue, the more you rely on your population being educated and efficient in the workforce, rather than just pulling gold or pulling, bananas or pulling oil out of the ground, whatever it might be. The incentive towards educating your population tends to force countries to be more progressive because they won't stand for being pushed down as much. They know that they're being oppressed. They have the tools to be able to combat it, at least a little. And it's much easier, in fact, to build an oppressive regime when your wealth comes from the land. It's harder when it comes from the people. So in general, this is a good thing that Saudi Arabia is moving towards a less oil-dependent economy. And MBS is going for a dual-pronged approach on this. So make some small things more progressive for the people so that they don't feel like they're being oppressed as much, but clamp down even harder to suppress the dissent. So make things feel a bit better for people, but when people complain, crush them. And what that means is, actually, the country is not getting much more progressive. They can certainly talk about big things that they're doing, like allowing women to drive. Just take a moment to really soak that in, that's a big step forward. And yet, if anybody complains about it, or even the people who advocated for women to drive, the main activists that were pushing for it, they got imprisoned as the law came into effect, allowing women to drive. So clamp down on the people who want more, but give them little bits, right? So that's the dual-pronged approach that MBS is going for here. Now, I also want to point out that the sports investments that we're going to talk about a lot, as estimated by another journalist who is very heavily involved in this kind of reporting, this other journalist estimates that between 2 to 3x of their sports investments are going into other like venture capital companies in the US, other companies like that. But on the sports side, they were trying to build a tourism industry for Saudi Arabia that is built on sport. You want to go to Riyadh because they have a big sporting event on, big WWE event, big UFC event, big fight happening, big football match happening between stars that they've bought from elsewhere in Europe and all around the world. Big esports event that you want to fly there for, etc. They also have, for example, Riyadh Air, right, which is an airline, of course, that serves Riyadh, is the main sponsor of Atletico Madrid. Its first flight is scheduled for 2025. It's their current, it's their main sponsor of Atletico Madrid. It doesn't fly. Its maiden flight is in 2025. So they are like pumping money in for things thinking, you know, out in the future. So why are they doing so much of it based around sports? So the sports washing concept is often for reputational repair. So by making you associate the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia with things that you like F1, WWE, esports, UFC, whatever it might be, footballers, by making that association more powerful, you decrease the association that makes you think Kingdom of Saudi Arabia human rights abuses or something like that. Kingdom of Saudi Arabia killed Khashoggi, that kind of thing. So you're doing some reputational repair in that sense by, you know, the process of what you associate with. You're also making people come to Riyadh and experience a nice time. You're also making people directly, by giving them things that they enjoy, you're helping with your reputation as well. And you're also kind of, like I said before, making them a bit complicit. Like, if I enjoy this thing, well, then I can't really talk shit about the people who are giving the money for it, can I? That would be a bit hypocritical. I don't give a fuck. I'm going to talk about this later, but I don't give a fuck if you're a hypocrite. Speak up. Even, especially if you're going to also partake of it, which you should be trying to limit as much as humanly possible. Right, so why would they need to do reputational repair anyway? And here we come to the crux of things, right? Because I feel like a lot of people understand that there are human rights abuses going on in Saudi Arabia, but again, the amount of people that were on my stream talking about, isn't this just the same as the US, indicates that people simply don't know what's happening. People haven't read enough about what is genuinely going on. So, under MBS, there has been a significant increase in capital punishment, something that they had promised to reduce in the time since he took over. It's actually increased. There have been massive human rights violations. There were 80 civilian deaths in 2022 in Yemen from 3 different attacks, as well as 156 injuries. These are civilian deaths and injuries, something that I'm sure we're all familiar with hearing about from the crisis happening in Israel and Gaza right now as well. Since 2015, there have been an estimated 377,000 killed in Yemen from a lack of food, healthcare, infrastructure, because the war regime there has targeted homes, hospitals, schools, bridges, things that the society needs to be able to function, run its infrastructure, and keep people alive. They've also had massive amounts of abuse and exploitation of migrant workers via this kafala system that I'm sure you'll have heard about because of the Qatari World Cup, which is essentially basically forced labor because the employers hold on to the work visas and can use that against them at any point. There are many different reports that you can look about how bad this system is as well. And over 80% of the private sector workforce are migrant workers. And yet there is a massive systemic problem with abuse and exploitation of these people. For example, 89 Kenyan workers, over half of them female, died under suspicious circumstances during 2020 and 2021. Most of those were not investigated. They're just like, oh, suspicious. Anyway, you can't contest your detention or deportation if you're a migrant worker, kept in disgusting conditions most of the time as well. And employers can report the workers for leaving abusive situations. So if you're in an abusive situation where your employer holds your visa as well, so they're dangling that over your head saying, you have to do these things, otherwise I'll, get rid of your visa. If they do get rid of your visa, or if they do report you for leaving because you decide, fuck this, I'm out, then at that point, you become like an illegal immigrant within the system because you lack the paperwork to say that you're there legally because your employer's just unilaterally taken it away from you. And at that point, you get detained, deported. You can't contest either of them. You're kept in horrible conditions.
Play a shooter in Roblox?
And
a good
you just
one
have no
or a bad
recourse
one?
whatsoever. On top of this, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has a massive problem with imprisoning women's rights activists. As I said earlier, the very people who were campaigning for the laws that ended up passing, allowing women to drive, they got put into jail for that. Even though their campaign was successful, bye-bye, you're in jail anyway.
Cool. Well, fun,
and
man.
Most recently, a report which I think, even if you could somehow hand wave the rest away, this has got to hit you just viscerally in the gut, I feel, which is this report from Human Rights Watch, which is that there have been killings of hundreds of Ethiopian migrants at the Yemen border across 2023. And this is, I mean, this entire video is not a nice experience, is it? But this next quote is awful. It's from Hamdia, who's 14 years old. We were fired on repeatedly. I saw people killed in a way I have never imagined. I saw 30 people killed on the spot. I pushed myself under a rock and slept there. I could feel people sleeping around me. I realized what I thought were people sleeping around me were actually dead bodies. I woke up and I was alone. And since 2014, I mean, I'm not going to go through the entirety of this article, but you can look at it yourself if you have a Google or look on this Human Rights Watch website. But since 2014, these killings have been happening, but they have now escalated to the point at which they've gone from occasional shootings of people at the border to an apparent widespread systematic policy to execute migrants as soon as they arrive, basically, which is a crime against humanity if it can be shown to be part of state policy. And I'm not saying that as, I feel like, again, people maybe don't understand that some of these statements, some of these phrases like crime against humanity, it's a fixed thing within international law. It's got a definition. If you can prove certain things about it to be true, you have committed this thing. It's not just a word that people toss around, like, my mum's grounded me. That's a human rights abuse or something. These are defined terms. And again, if it can be shown that the Saudi government has had this policy, at the moment it's being inferred that they have this policy because it's so widespread and so systematic. But if there was a leak of some document that showed that this policy was in place, this would be a simple crime against humanity. There are reports in here of migrants who were hit with explosives, people who were asked which body part they would like to be shot in before they had it shot off and then were killed. And conservatively, the conservative estimate is that hundreds have been killed at the border. Again, this is across between like 2022 and 2023. Conservatively, hundreds have been killed, but it could easily number in the thousands. It's very difficult to tell how high it could go. Estimates from the survivors in these kind of situations, when they've been interviewed, put the figures at over 50% of these. A group arrives at the border and over 50% of them end up being killed at the border. So what I want to indicate with some of these reports is that one of the aspects of this sports washing is that it provides an opportunity for the Saudi regime to push and magnify these small progressive changes within the country while it still commits abuses that undermine every aspect of those small changes. Sports also acts as a distraction for the local domestic youth. Sports is a fantastic vehicle for that. That's one of the reasons why we all love sports and esports. It's aspirational. It's entertaining. It's distracting. And it's also nationalistic a lot of the time as well, especially because in these tournaments, they like promoting local Saudi talent or local Saudi teams or that kind of thing. And these are all amazing characteristics to divert public attention away from the lack of civil liberties. These are all fantastic distractions from that. Saudi Arabia also allowed women to attend sports stadiums recently. So that's, a dub in the column in the really, really tiny column that's getting massively outweighed by the enormous amount of human rights abuses, but a dub in the column that, again, ties into their overall idea of providing a circus for the masses. And I've barely mentioned, I think only once, the horrendous dismembering and killing of the journalist Khashoggi in 2018, which brought, massive, widespread international attention from the international community to the human rights abuses happening in Saudi Arabia. The US imposed sanctions on 17 Saudis that were involved in the murder, and the WWE just immediately continued running events in Saudi Arabia, and everybody else just followed suit. This is one of the reasons why precedents matter, why standing up for even just one thing can actually have a cascading event later on as well. And it completely normalized sports washing. If you can murder a journalist in a different country and really not face any repercussions, any consequences for that in terms of how people interact with your country, then what could possibly stop you from doing all of that again? Unless people have an instant visceral response to not engage with what the country's putting on offer, you will always lose. I want to point out here as well that the sports aspect of it doesn't require the sports side, right? If you look at what Messi is up to, Lionel Messi was paid $25 million over 3 years for a contract that did not involve him playing for a Saudi team. The contract, which details have been leaked to journalists within the sports scene, again, remember, $25 million over 3 years, and this is what's in it. A few commercial appearances, some social media posts, and some free vacations to Saudi Arabia, where Messi then has to post some images on social with some hashtags. And over those 3 years, he must not make any disparaging comments about Saudi Arabia. So the list goes for $25 million for Messi.
So fucking cooked, dude.
Few commercial appearances, some social media posts, and don't talk about the bad things that Saudi does. They're buying silence and positive association. If you could, that contract is the definition of what they're trying to achieve with sports washing, and the fact that people don't see it and can't see through it is laughable, I think. It's a real indictment of people's critical thinking skills. So, again, I'm going to continue talking a little bit more about what kind of things would Messi potentially be disparaging about Saudi Arabia for? What kind of things would you have reason to have them buy your silence? Well, I've already talked about the increases in capital punishment, but there's also a lot of cruel punishment, especially for social media posts, actually. Speaking about the way that Messi's contract is structured, for dissent. Now, these are people, sometimes with less than 100 followers, who are getting cruel punishment for posting on Twitter. They're Saudi people who are getting punished for this. I said earlier that the Public Investment Fund has invested in a bunch of different US companies. One of them is Twitter. So MBS, via the Public Investment Fund, has a fairly decent-sized stake in Twitter. And the way that came to be is that another Saudi billionaire, Prince Al-Walid, I'm terrible with these names, Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, he owns more than 5% of Twitter through an investment company. And during the restructuring of the regime in Saudi, once MBS took over, this Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, the Saudi billionaire, was held captive in Riyadh for 83 days while MBS purged the royal family using torture, coercion, seizure of assets. So that was in 2017, 2018. 5 years later, he then sold 17% of that investment company over to the Public Investment Fund after getting his shit in line, right? At least that's how it would appear from the Saudis' point of view. So even the other people who were involved in other investment funds they all end up interlinked within the Saudi system. Because if you are if you're a rich person in Saudi, you're probably a member of the royal family. And if you're a member of the royal family, you fit into that hierarchy. Otherwise, you would not be allowed to exist currently, certainly to hold a elevated position. So if you are in any way powerful within Saudi, you fit into MBS's system. And that means that you are involved directly in what's going on there. So yeah, as I was saying, MBS with a fairly decent size amount of Twitter. The US government alleged that a senior aide to MBS was infiltrating Twitter, and this infiltration allowed anonymous Twitter users to be found and jailed by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. There is currently a Twitter employee who's been convicted in the US for this case, where the involvement in Twitter, the investment, directly allowed them to infiltrate the company, find dissidents, find people who were trying to spread activism on Twitter anonymously, find them physically in the real world, and then jail them. The long arm of the law in horribly, horribly corrupt ways. The kingdom has currently been described as more by people who are currently there, by the way, as more restrictive, more heavily policed, and more punitive punishment than people have seen in their lifetime in Saudi Arabia. That's currently, right? So we're not talking about a, regime that's on the up and up, as much as people would like to tell you that. That's not the case. 2022 saw 196 executions, to refer back to capital punishment, including 81 of them on a single day, which is the largest single mass execution in decades, despite them promising again that they were going to reduce capital punishment. Only 3 of those were for murder charges. The rest were for terrorism charges, which I think a lot of them were probably very suspect. The legal system in Saudi, it's not that good, as you might expect from a system where there are no checks and balances to power. The legal system is a joke. Systemic abuse is normalized. There's no good systems of law as you would expect if you've lived most of your life in a democratic country with rule of law. There were 100 executions from January to October of 2023. Many of those were tortured, given no legal representation, or just tried privately, completely just behind closed doors, for criticizing the government. For example, a 54-year-old teacher was sentenced to death for tweeting to 10 followers criticizing the state. 10 followers, and got a death sentence. A university student from Leeds University, which is like an hour and a half down the road from me, was given a 34-year prison sentence. Originally, they were given a 3-year prison sentence for tweeting to 2,600 followers. And that's more than 10 followers, but that is not a large amount of followers. They are not, clamping down on the biggest people in Saudi, the biggest activists. They are coming after anybody and trying to make it specifically as cruel as possible to stop you from speaking out at all, to utterly silence you. So originally, the sentence was 3 years for tweeting to 2,600 followers about women's rights. And that was extended to 34 years upon appeal because they retweeted other people who had more severe takes than theirs. So they got 31 years added to their sentence for hitting the retweet button on other people's opinions that were more severe than the things that they had actually tweeted out. She was back in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, this Leeds University student, to bring her husband and children back to the UK with her to escape the regime when she was apprehended. Another woman, straight after that, was given 45 years in prison, again, for tweeting. I haven't spoken very much about women's rights during this video, so let's go into that as well. They're now allowed to drive, cool, but they have a guardianship system, which is crazy. I mean, in order to do most things that we wouldn't even think of as requiring somebody's permission to do, you need a male guardian's permission to do that, which is either going to be some member of your family or it's going to be your husband. There is, I feel like I have to say this, even though it's just so obvious, but there is obviously no anti-discrimination laws, as there are in many other countries around the world, to stop private companies treating men better than women, right? That's an obvious one. But then also, on top of that, leading women's rights advocate jailed for 1,001 days recently. I think their sentence is finished recently. It's not ongoing 1,001 days, but it lasted 1,001 days. Their family was banned for traveling completely. Not the person that was jailed. I mean, obviously they're banned from traveling. They're locked up. But the rest of their family banned from traveling. MBS also removed the need for male consent to travel. And this immediately led to an increase in women refugees away from Saudi Arabia. Even MBS removing the fact that you need permission to leave the country is actually heavily disputed, because in March 2022, which is like, a year and a half ago, Saudi Arabia passed a law which reinforced and codified the guardianship situation. It was previously kind of like an informal collection of rules, and it was passed into a document which reinforced all of this, which you need male permission to marry. Financial support from people as a woman is conditional on obedience. You must obey within reason, at least within their version of reason, in order to receive financial support. So basically, you can just get removed at any point. You need male permission to get some forms of sexual and reproductive health care. And you need male permission to leave prison. Wrap your head around that one. So if, for example, this women's rights activist has been put in jail, they need a member of their family or their husband to give them permission to leave jail, even once their sentence has finished. Holy mother of God. And the male guardians have a large amount of flexibility in what constitutes lack of obedience to get women arrested. The law as written says that withholding sex is a lack of obedience. Not living at home, that's lack of obedience. Not traveling with the male companion, that's a lack of obedience. So if you go on a trip, a work trip, and you tell your wife to come with you, they have to come. Otherwise, that's illegal. If your wife wants to leave the house for a night and stay out somewhere, and you don't want her to, that's lack of obedience. And I'll get to how they enforce that a little bit later on as well. But let's continue. Marriages can also happen under 18 if the child is post-puberty and the marriage is of an established benefit to the child, locking them into this horrendous system of male guardianship at an early age. And this isn't to say that there haven't been wins for the women's rights movement. Women can now drive, they can attend sports events, they can go on pilgrimage without male guardians. And women over the age of 21 can get a passport and go abroad, like I said, without male permission. But you still need consent if you're 18 to 21. And you can still face the same legal claim of absence under the woman is away from home. They're not living at home. So they can still enforce that by, filing a claim that there's a lack of obedience happening there, that you told them to stay home, I guess, and they went traveling. And again, even these wins from the women's rights side, from these women's rights activists, the activists who fought for the legal changes got arrested and jailed, even as the laws were enacted to change what they were going for. It's despicable. And if there are no consequences, then there is no counter to the sports washing. There are conflicting camps on what is a reasonable counter, a reasonable consequence. A number of the people who are activists inside Saudi say that they can't ask people not to take money from Saudi Arabia. Even when it comes to sports personalities, there are a lot of people within Saudi who are not willing to say people are wrong for taking money from the government. Now, I'm going to say that. I believe that. But that doesn't mean that everybody shares that same ethical line in the sand. But certainly if you can afford to do so comfortably, like many sports professionals can, it is another level of sickening to me. But what the people within Saudi Arabia, what the activists advocate for, is that if you're going to take the money from them, at least use your platform to spread awareness of the bad, heinous shit that's going on within the country. I believe, however, that it's not really enough to be aware of what's going on without changing how you interact with the country and with its investments, with the goals that it's trying to achieve. And like I said earlier in this video, I don't really care about hypocrisy that much. I would much rather you continue to watch F1 or, Gamers 8 or something like that and still loudly speak out against what's happening in Saudi Arabia. I would much rather you didn't consume a bunch of the content that's tied into Saudi money and also advocated for the human rights abuses within the regime to end, but at least do what you can. I'd rather have you give up a few things if you don't feel like you can give up everything. I don't want you to just quit the whole idea because you can't stick to a hard moral line. Give up something. Try some level of consequence. Vote with your wallet, at least to some degree. And I want to talk at the end here about a very different situation that I think is quite relevant. And it's the way in which sports organizations acted towards apartheid in South Africa. Because I think there are lessons to be learned there about what actually creates pressure on a country to change its behavior. And you can argue and, you can look at reports and stuff about how much any of what I'm talking about with sports actually affected the dismantling of apartheid within South Africa. But at the very least, what I'm talking about within the sports world right now made changes within the sports world, right? Because previously, South Africa had completely segregated sports teams. It was only the all-white team that was able to go anywhere, travel, participate in the big sports, etc. And so, due to activism within the sports world, that aspect of the apartheid was eroded away. And I would like to think that because sports has this, as we spoke about earlier, kind of aspirational quality to it, and because it's so front and center in the way in which people interact with the world, with their entertainment, I'd like to think that it was inspirational in doing more knock-on effects too. But as I say, that's quite disputed. But let's start from the beginning. In the mid-1950s, South African sportsmen were campaigning to end segregated sports within their country. And for context, if you're really unaware of what happened, because this was quite a long time ago, and for most of you in a different continent, in the 1990s, apartheid was dismantled. So this is 40 years prior. In 1956, the first sport to have some kind of victory against segregated sports was table tennis. So if you're thinking to yourself, well, we're just in the esports world, we're tiny, we're such a small piece of the pie, what the hell can any of this actually matter? How, I'm one person, what the fuck can I do? Remember, again, 1956, leading the way is motherfucking table tennis in trying to allow mixed teams from South Africa rather than the all-white team. So you can try. You can try to set some kind of cascade in motion. Now there, the South African government restricted their passports, so the mixed team was not allowed to travel, but the initiative did encourage others to act. In 1961, there was some progress in soccer, and then they went back on the decision in 1963, 2 years later, and then continued protest from African and Asian countries got them back in line by 1964, allowing mixed teams to compete. And this was constantly being attacked by the government of South Africa, retaliating against the players, clamping down on activists throughout all of this, trying to get their friends in international communities on their side as well. And one notable point here is that remember that while South Africa did have plenty of other friends across the world at the time in the international community, they didn't have the sheer wealth that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia currently does. The biggest obstacle to tackling any of this is just that money talks, and Saudi Arabia have a fuck ton of money, more money than God. But inside South Africa, the sports bodies had varied effort to make reforms, some trying to push, some resisting, but they still all had to work within the rules of the government bans. For example, the government was banning mixed teams attending the Olympics, so if a mixed group of people was going to attend the Olympics, they had to all attend as individuals. They couldn't say that they were going as a team. They were like, oh, I'm just going to the Olympics on my own. Anyone else fancy coming with me? Because mixed teams of black and white players were specifically banned. And again, this is another large difference. This wouldn't and couldn't happen within Saudi Arabia because the sports organizations are the government, right? The sports organizations can't have small revolutions against the government's rules because the people who run the sports organizations are the members of the government. They are the members of the royal family. They are the people in power, the people who are directly there enforcing and at times creating the legislature that would be clamping down on this. There will never be dissent from within these structures because it is so top down. In 1964, South Africa was excluded from the Tokyo Olympics, and I want to read you this quote from what happened there. The British anti-apartheid representative at the Olympic Committee meeting was joined by a white South African who had managed to leave the country to represent South African non-racial Olympic Committee. So one of the members of an activist group in South Africa, one of the white members, had managed to leave, go to the Olympic Committee, meet up with the British anti-apartheid representative, and they both acted on behalf of the activist group from inside South Africa, and found that senior officials of the International Olympic Committee were strongly committed to keeping the white South Africa in the Olympic Games despite open violation of the Olympic Charter. Now, if you're unaware, the Olympic Charter has as one of its primary things, that you shall not discriminate against people and that anyone of merit should be able to rise to the top. Classic sports things, classic things that we in gaming and esports and sports more generally constantly advocate for. And South Africa also enjoyed extensive support among representatives of most Western countries. It was only by the coordination of efforts of the Afro-Asian representatives, which is a lot of the African nations, and then also India, who were at the forefront of attacking apartheid in South Africa at the time as well. They were supported by some of the socialist countries and one or two officials from Western Europe, and that was enough to tip it over the line, and apartheid sport was excluded from the Olympic Games in 1964. One of the biggest reasons was because the African nations were threatening boycotts. That was the big thing that time and time again, if you read about how the sports system in South Africa got changed, it was boycotts from other nations, from other groups. Now, if you think about this in the esports sense, that would be like if organizations banded together and decided not to attend big events and it tanked their viewership. decided not to attend Gamers 8, decided not to participate in some big league that was going on. Now, they are financially incentivized to because there's a large amount of money. They're also financially incentivized to because it's an esports winter happening and people can't get investment from elsewhere. And if you just want to keep taking money instead of downsizing, you are eventually going to have to take from the worst people possible, of which the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Public Investment Fund ranks really, really fucking highly. So in 1976, to move things forwards a little bit again, African nations also threatened a boycott if New Zealand didn't get suspended from the Olympic Games as well for continuing to have contact and friendly relations with South Africa. So that's a very different move again, right? That's not just saying the African nations had already been successful in threatening a boycott and getting South Africa banned. So again, think about this in the current esports terms. It would be some kind of coordinated boycott to get these Saudi Arabian events have much lower viewership because people aren't participating in them. Large organizations are participating in them. So this is talking about threatening a boycott if another entity interacts with them. The Olympics refused to suspend New Zealand, and the African teams did boycott the Olympics, leading only 1 year later to an agreement between all of the Commonwealth teams to avoid contact with countries who were in apartheid, which was basically the main perpetrator was South Africa. 4 years later, in 1980, the UN Center Against Apartheid started a register of sports people and officials who had participated in events within South Africa, adding some social pressure on top to not get onto the register. And some sports bodies even used it to discipline the athletes as well. Like you've participated in an event that was associated with South Africa, you're going to get disciplined. Not all of them. The main use of it was just to shame the people involved. And you could get your name struck off the list by having it in writing that you committed as a sports person not to return to apartheid South Africa to compete again. Imagine having even just that central shaming system. We are so far away from that even within esports. There is no large stigma at the moment. It feels like there's something brewing to the surface in Counter-Strike to that degree, but there's also a lot of apathy and a lot of people directly pushing against it too, when it's such an obvious ethical line to take that you just should not be participating in things that are directly helping to minimize the human rights abuses, the crimes against humanity that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is perpetrating. Not everybody in the world is an informed apathist. A lot of people learn about something, decide not to act on it. That's them. But a lot of people just don't know enough to care or don't have a reason to directly care about it. And that's what talking about it in this kind of way is designed to do, is give you a reason to care about this kind of topic. And I think one of the big lessons here is that boycotts are one of the only effective measures against this kind of thing. Boycotts are one of the only ways in which you can have a social consequence to these kind of things occurring. But they've got to be preceded by enough discussion and enough outrage, frankly, to make those boycotts serious actions, to get enough people interested, to get enough people on board. And I will say that boycotts with regards to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia do seem to be significantly harder due to the amount of money involved. In order to boycott in a way which counteracts the spending from Saudi Arabia, it would have to be enormous. Like, for example, if you were going to try to boycott an organization,
it'd have to be your entire fucking teams
because they were doing dealings really tightly with Saudi. That's going to be really difficult for you as a consumer to outweigh the investment that Saudi's putting in, because Saudi have outrageous amounts of money. But that is the end goal to these kind of actions, is to try to attempt to make the sports washing as inefficient as possible by continuing to loudly talk about all of the problems while these events are going on, and to make it more expensive to work with Saudi Arabia than to avoid them. Make the capitalistic greed in some way, in some small way, work for your ethical goals rather than against them. Attempt, wherever you can, to vote with your wallet and focus on things that people are emotional about. They're not emotional about venture capital companies. You're not going to get emotional because the public investment fund is invested in
That's
Uber.
really, really hard, though.
I mean, we all know that Uber fucking sucks anyway. But people are emotional about sports. And people near and dear to us are emotional about esports. So focusing on that aspect is where we might be able to get some traction and try to stop one of the most repressive, hateful, abusive regimes taking over the esports, gaming, and wider tech world. And at the very least, at least we'll go down screaming about it. Again, if you're interested in learning more about this topic, please check out.
It kind of feels like we're in a big losing battle, since the fact that esports in general has slowly been dying out. So Saudi Arabia just coming in and dumping millions. It's really, really hard. Because if they didn't put on this Overwatch tournament, who could have? I get what he means, though. I absolutely agree with everything he said. I knew there was some really bad stuff going on over there, but I didn't get to what degree it was. I'm glad I only watched the last match. Yo, what's up? Regressing. Oi, oi, oi. You're such a fucking nerd. Baka. You whore. Is it time for Bloons Tower Defense 6? Is it time for Bloons Tower Defense 6? 20 more minutes into I'm on! 20 more minutes into I'm on! Ah, fuck. I forgot it does that shit. What if I do... Is it time? It's time cut. I reset my account.